Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Alexandra Middlewood, who's an associate professor and chair in the Department of Political Science at Wichita State University. I met Alex, I don't even remember, a couple of years ago.
2022.
It was a long time ago, and haven't really seen her since. But we spent like 2.5 solid days together exploring interdisciplinary work on gun injury prevention and attitudes towards guns and firearm violence. So I'm very excited to be able to continue that conversation. Just as a little bit of background, a quick introduction. Alex earned her PhD in political science, yay for the political scientist, from the University of Kansas, and her MA, also political science from the University of Arkansas, and a BS in political science from Central Michigan University. Her research analyzes the political behavior of gun owners in the United States. She also publishes research in public opinion, gun policy, and Kansas politics. She's the author of numerous publications. I'm going to just mention a couple that are most relevant to this group. She's the author of Tactical is the New Black, Examining Gun Owner Fashion as Political Expression, with Noah Schwartz and Ann Wassinger. She is also the author of The Massacre Generation, Young People and Attitudes About Mass Shooting Prevention with Abigail Vector, and A Silver Bullet, Gun Ownership and Political Participation in Rural America. Today, Alex is going to share her investigation on a very understudied group of young gun owners in the United States, particularly those who have purchased firearms during the great buying spree of 2020. So today, the talk is the new generation. Who are the young gun owners in the United States? Alex, welcome to On Target.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. So I have a presentation, and then there will definitely be time at the end to go over any questions that you may have. And I'm sure there will be many because there always is. Um, so, as Jennifer mentioned, my research primarily focuses on the political behavior of gun owners in the United States. This piece is a little bit more of a sociological piece, studying more, demographically, who are young gun owners. And when I say young gun owners, I mean specifically people under the age of 35 who are purchasing firearms. So in political science, we typically call young adults anyone under the age of 35. So that's where that cutoff comes from. And this work is co-authored with Abigail Vector, who's at William Jewell College, but couldn't be here with us today. So, an important vein of this research is gun culture 2.0. You may or may not be familiar with what this is. David Yamini has really coined this term. And gun culture in the United States, even today, is still deeply rooted, dates back to the nation's founding. This is probably not surprising to most of us. And its origins are really traced back to colonial, revolutionary, and Republican eras of American society. And when I say Republican, I mean small r Republican, not big R Republican. I always feel the need to clarify as a political scientist. And the United States really stands out as the only modern, industrialized, urban country that continues to uphold a distinct gun culture. We know that approximately 75 million Americans own approximately 400 million firearms in the United States. Historically, these have served really practical purposes, things like hunting, self-defense, national defense, and also as a symbolized patriotism, civic responsibility, and active citizenship. In the 1960s and 70s, we start to see gun culture shift away from this kind of hunting, sports shooting type of culture and really become centered on self-defense. And that's the transition from gun culture 1.0 to gun culture 2.0. And this transition was really complete around 2010 when self-defense had become the core of American gun culture. So today in public opinion surveys, when we ask gun owners, what's the most important reason on why you own a firearm? Vast majority of them tell us that it's because of self-defense. They want to be able to protect themselves should something happen and they need to be able to. And so this becomes important because gun culture 2.0 really sets the foundation for why American gun owners have this psychological attachment to their firearms and how ownership became a core part of their social and political identity. And so 2010 to 2020, we start to really focus on self-defense as this gun culture 2.0. And then this really takes off in 2020 with what we academics are calling the great gun buying spree of 2020. So gun ownership in the US is a highly visible and contested facet of political and cultural life. And as well, in much of the academic literature, we typically have this stereotypical view of who a owner is. We typically think of a gun owner as being white, male, living in a rural area, typically politically conservative. And this image has really informed assumptions about who own guns, what they believe, and how they are likely to behave at the ballot box. Yet, really, since 2020, we see that more evidence is suggesting that gun ownership in the US is changing. It's becoming much more diverse. Um, and so while we see this increased diversity, particularly in 2020, with this great gun buying spree, we have very little academic research that actually studies gun owners in their kind of demographic groups, with the exception of gender. We see a little bit on partisanship and we see a little bit on race. But we know even less about LGBTQ gun owners, about young gun owners, about these groups of people who are increasingly purchasing firearms since 2020. So in 2020, we see this huge, unprecedented surge in firearms purchases in the United States, and it was driven by a convergence of crises. So the COVID-19 pandemic, widespread protests following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, rising political polarization, and also fears of political instability with the 2020 presidential election. We also have seen a few studies come out since then that have shown that financial instability has also led to increased gun ownership among men and women in 2020 specifically. So these situations, right, or this convergence of crises, as I just talked about, may sound a little familiar to us if we've been paying attention to the news and what's happening right now. And so while the foundation and the kind of grounding of this research today is in 2020, I do feel the need to say that I think it's likely we see another great gun buying spree this year in 2026, because of what has been happening again in Minneapolis because of political instability and rising political polarization, even more than in 2020. So in 2020, we saw that the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System did almost 40 million background checks on firearm sales in 2020. This is an all-time record and was nearly a 40% increase from the previous year. We also know that a significant portion of new gun buyers during 2020 were Black, Latino, Asian American, were women, were liberal, were all of these groups that were historically underrepresented among gun owners. And so, similar to other identity groups, we know that gun owners encompass multiple identities, and this growing diversity within gun owners is really striking. This group continues to diversify, but still little is known about the psychological attachment that these subgroups of gun owners have to their guns. And so, in this research, we really focus on this and examine the US's young gun owners in particular. We did see an increase of young people purchasing firearms in 2020. And we have seen more and more young people, particularly young liberals, purchasing firearms ever since. And so we are really looking at this from the perspective of we have this new subgroup of gun owners that is becoming more powerful within American politics. And so it's important to know who they are and to understand the psychological attachments that they do have to their firearms. And so, what do we know about generational perspectives on guns? So, we know that young Americans, again, those under the age of 35, hold really distinct political attitudes towards firearms and gun policy. We know that these have been shaped by their generational experiences and their socio-political context. Young Americans are more likely to believe that government action can prevent mass shootings and that gun laws should be stricter. They also have lower favorability ratings of the National Rifle Association. And this is distinct really post 2012 in particular. So we start to see the shift in public opinion about whether government can do something to prevent mass shootings with Sandy Hook in 2012. But we also see really notable examples also be amplified by youth activism following high profile mass shootings, particularly Parkland in 2018, where we saw this huge wave of youth mobilization and this critique of entrenched gun culture in the US. And so, despite their general aversion to firearms as a generation, young people are not absent from the gun owning population. We know that childhood exposure to firearms remains the strongest predictor of adult gun ownership, and approximately 79% of Americans under the age of 30 who grew up in gun owning households cited protection as the primary reason for why they now own a firearm themselves. And so having that exposure during childhood while growing up really leads to being more likely to purchase a firearm as these young adults get older. And so not only are we seeing more young people purchasing firearms, but we're seeing more people in general purchase firearms since 2020. And so that is also leading to this socialization of their children who then get of age and purchase firearms for themselves. And this 79% of Americans under the age of 30 who say self-protection is the primary reason for owning guns. That's higher than any other age cohort. So it is really unique to these Americans under the age of 30. And so this suggests that there's some tension here between generational liberalism and individual self-protection, especially as younger Americans are disproportionately affected by mass shootings and political instability. And so we really wanted to follow this and to look at who these young gun owners are. So our research really contributes to the growing literature on American gun ownership. And we focus specifically on those young gun owners as a distinct socio-political group. Prior research has examined gun ownership through the lens of race, gender, partisanship, but age has often been treated as a control variable rather than as a central category of analysis. And so we look at age specifically as this distinct subgroup of gun owners. To do this, we use three different surveys of nationally representative data. And this really allows us to deaggregate by age, race, gender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, to allow for as nuanced an understanding as possible of the socio and psychological dimensions of gun ownership among young adults. So the first survey that we use is the 2021 General Social Survey. This is a survey of just over 4,000 adults age 18 and older who live in the US. And in this survey, we really just use this data to focus on the demographic characteristics of young gun owners. So to look at gender, race, marital status, whether they're a hunter or not, education level, partisanship, ideology, which is separate from partisanship, religious service attendance, prayer frequency, evangelicalism, and geographic region within the United States. And so, because this is such a large survey, we wanted to use this one in particular to kind of parse out these demographic characteristics for young gun owners. The second survey was fielded using the Lucid platform in May of 2021. So, this was my co author survey. And she received some funding from the American Political Science Association to be able to look at this, to study specifically civil religion in the United States. But because her specialty is religion and gun ownership, we were able to sneak in some gun owner questions into this survey. And this second survey looks at just over 23, or sorry, just under 2,400 participants. They're representative of America on all major demographic characteristics. And we use, typical screening questions and other forms of fraud protection to make sure that we have quality data in this Lucid survey. And so, in addition to understanding young gun owners descriptively, like we did using that GSS survey, We also wanted to assess if young gun owners were more likely to adopt a gun owner identity. And to do that, we asked all people in the survey who said that they personally own a firearm, how important is being a gun owner to your identity? And so we asked them that question to see if maybe young people had different attachments to their firearms, or it was a different degree of importance to their socio-political identity than other age groups within gun owners. And the third survey that we used was also on the Lucid platform. This was in June of 2023. So we wanted to give it a couple of years to be able to see if we saw any major changes to who was answering this survey or to who were owning firearms. So this survey looks at just under 2,000 participants, again, representative of Americans on all major demographic characteristics. And we were able to learn more about young gun owners in this data set than we were in the earlier surveys. So we asked how old our individuals were when they first bought a gun, how many guns they own, and how owning a gun makes them feel. This also allowed us to capture the attachment that young gun owners may have towards other social groups. So we also asked how strongly respondents identify with other members of their generation. So in this case, other people who are under the age of 35, and how attached they are to their political party or their partisanship. So we wanted to see if there were some nuances here for young gun owners, if they were more attached to their firearms, for example, that maybe it was because they had less attachment to other people in their generation or to their political party. So we asked those questions. So, what did we find? Who are the young gun owners? So, this first set is compared to other young people. So, we're not looking at young gun owners compared to other gun owners yet. This is specifically to other people under the age of 35. We found that young owners are more likely to be conservative, but not Republican. And so they are more likely to say that they are conservative, but not identify with the Republican Party. So this could be part of a larger trend of what we, call the independent voter. However, we did ask these respondents in the survey, even if they identify as independent, which party do they lean towards, Republicans or Democrats? And we included that in this measure of the Republican Party. And so they were still not more likely to be Republican, just be conservative. They were more likely to be white than any other race. And they were also more likely to say that they are a hunter than other young people, which makes sense. If you're a hunter, you have to own a firearm. Well, maybe not have to, but most of them do. We also found that they are less likely to be migrants to the South. And so they are less likely to have moved from somewhere else in the United States to the South. So part of the reason we included some of these geographic questions is because there is research out there that shows that there are more gun owners in the South, and that there are also a really large concentration of gun owners in the Great Plains. And so we wanted to be able to see if geography had anything to do with what we were finding, and if they were more likely to be concentrated in one of these geographic areas. And we did not find that to be the case. We also found that, compared to other young people, there's no statistical difference on gender, on education level, on partisanship, on marital status, or on religiosity questions. And so, for the most part, young gun owners look a lot like other young people in their generation. So, they're a little more conservative, they're a little more likely to be white. But they're not more likely to be women or men, to have higher or lower education, to be of one party or another, to be married. All of these things that we know can influence who is purchasing a firearm. We didn't find any statistical difference. And this lack of distinction between young gun owners and other young people on partisanship and religiosity are particularly novel, as previous studies of gun owners show stark partisan differences and stark religious differences on gun owners compared to non-gun owners. And so then we compared young gun owners to other gun owners, so people over the age of 35. And compared to those older owners, under the age of 35 are more likely to be women. They are more likely to be hunters than older gun owners. They are more likely to have gun owner identity. So to say that being a gun owner is an intrinsic part of their identity, and to also believe that gun owners are discriminated against in society and politics. And so the women question or the women finding here is interesting because we know that young people, or sorry, we know that women in particular are more likely to purchase firearms since the 1980s than they were prior, but really since 2020. And the reason that they purchase firearms is primarily because of protection reasons. They want to be able to protect themselves. As the old saying goes, God made man and woman, but Samuel Colt made them equal, right? So that's really part of this component of why women are purchasing firearms. And so we see that compared to older gun owners, young gun owners are more likely to be women, but they're also more likely to have this really strong attachment to their firearms through having that gun owner identity and also believing that gun owners are discriminated against. We did find that they are less likely to be married. Again, not particularly surprising because young people are waiting longer and longer in general to get married. And again, less likely to be migrants to the South. No differences on those other demographic characteristics like education level, partisanship, or religiosity. And so, for the most part, young gun owners look pretty similar to other young people. And different in some ways, but similar in other ways to other older gun owners. And so we asked gun owners how they feel about their generation. Do they feel an attachment or how strongly do they identify with other members of their generation? And we found that young gun owners feel less attached to their generation than other gun owners. So you can see descriptively, we have this chart here. We did run this as a statistical model as well. These same results hold that young gun owners are just less likely to feel attached to other young people who are under the age of 35, um, versus older gun owners feel attached to their same generational age cohort. We also found that older gun owners more strongly identify with their political party than young gun owners. And in this way, young gun owners are similar to other young people and distinct from older gun owners. And so owning a firearm doesn't particularly make young people more Republican or more Democrat. In this case, we would make the assumption of more Republican. They're still just as likely to not identify with a political party as other young people are, despite owning a firearm. And so we also asked these questions about feelings about ownership. We found that older and younger gun owners attach different feelings to their ownership. Older gun owners are more strongly attached to feelings of safety and responsibility to their ownership than younger gun owners. Whereas the younger subgroup feels that their ownership increases confidence and a sense of control. The older gun owners typically see gun ownership as impacting the safety and protection of their community, while the younger expresses that their ownership impacts their feelings about themselves. And so we can kind of see the difference here between gun culture 1.0 and gun culture 2.0, whereas 2.0 is really focused on, self-defense, but also being able to protect yourself, right? Having that confidence or that sense of control that owning a firearm gives a person who owns one. Whereas the older generation sees it more in an outward perspective of being able to protect themselves, sure, but specifically being able to protect their community and the safety and protection of others. We find that compared to older gun owners, young owners have a distinct demography. So they are, more likely to be women to hunt. They're less likely to be married or be in migrants to the South. And descriptively, They're more likely to be political independents than older gun owners. They more closely resemble other non-gun owning young people than they do other gun owners. Young gun owners don't differ significantly from non-owners in their generation when it comes to partisanship, to religiosity, which suggests that, like other young people, these formerly really important identity markers simply don't matter as much to this group in their generation. And we suggest that this leaves an opening for a stronger psychological attachment to their firearms. So they're not feeling this psychological attachment to their generation or to their political party. And so maybe they're using gun ownership to kind of fill that void. We don't have the questions to be able to answer this for sure. So we are extrapolating a little bit here from the data. But it certainly suggests that this could be possible. In addition to simply differing from older gun owners on questions of demographics, young gun owners are significantly more likely to have that psychological attachment to their firearms, to ascribe to gun owner social identity, and are more likely to believe that gun owners are discriminated against in the United States, which is a belief that we know often activates and heightens one's group attachment. And we suggest that this increased group attachment may result from the loss of attachment to these other key social groups. Generation, sorry, young gun owners experience cross-cutting identities as young people in a consistently liberal generation who also own firearms, which continues to maintain this really conservative political culture despite its ongoing diversification. And so we suggest that gun ownership as an identity fills this void that may be left from feeling underrepresented by two major political parties. And so, in conclusion, understanding this distinct group of gun owners really has significant political consequences. So, in recent years, gun owners have emerged as this really formidable political force in American politics. So, we know that gun owners are more likely to register to vote, to participate in politics in other ways, like signing petitions, donating money, etc., to participate in protests, even. Um, and so we have all of this research that shows these things. And previous studies suggest that gun owners differ significantly from non-owners on these important political measures, which therefore seems likely that young gun owners would also differ from other young people. However, some of the results in this study suggest that gun owners who are young may be more similar to other young people on these measures than they are to older gun owners. And we really will only know as time passes, as this newest cohort of gun owners will become the political subgroup within the larger whole. And understanding who they are and the meaning that they assign to their firearms is really key to understanding the future of the American gun debate, which is why we really wanted to focus on this group of young gun owners and figure out who they are, what do they care about, how are they participating in politics, which is a future step of this research. But we do think that regardless of the answers to these questions, these young gun owners will become the dominant group within gun owners as they get older. And so knowing how they assign that meaning to their firearms, knowing who they are, is really key to understanding the future of the gun debate in the United States. And I would be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Alex. My head is spinning with so many different things, but I'm going to hold my questions and see who else would like to jump in first. Okay, or maybe I'll start while people get their questions together. Um, oh, good. Actually, I'll let Wendy jump in. And then, Alex, you can feel free to moderate the questions just as they happen. Go ahead.
I just had two empirical questions for you. One was the surge in gun purchases in 2020 and the 40 million background checks. And I'm curious if you have a breakdown on which kinds of weapons younger people wanted to buy and whether those weapons are different from older, current gun owners. So you mentioned hunting. And I'm just curious if there is any gender differences there, or if you had data on the guns that they're buying, how many, or even just what type that they, if the FBI provides that. I'm not positive about that.
Yeah.
So that would be one question. I'll just give you the second question you could answer.
Okay.
The other one is in the survey data. I don't think this is in the general social survey, but it could be. Are there two questions? One is there a gun already in the household from where this person lives, especially young people? And second, does your partner, wife, spouse, whomever, family member have a gun? Because I'm
Mhm.
just curious. I would think that the people who either live with other people, and you said, sort of come from families or environments that are that hunt or that have had always had guns in the house. So I'm just curious about this new surge in young people and whether they have familiarity with guns or comfort level with guns that other people don't.
Yeah, so those are both great questions. I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'll jump back to the first question. Um, so in our surveys in particular, we asked, do you personally own a firearm? So there are lots of surveys that ask about household ownership, and leave it at that, or ask about household ownership and then also personal gun ownership. So we are measuring personal gun ownership specifically. There is a lot of kind of back and forth within the social science gun studies group of academics about whether we should be looking at all people who have a firearm in their home or if they personally are the owner and kind of which is better. For us in particular, because we were looking at that psychological attachment piece, we only looked at people who personally owned a firearm. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have the data necessarily especially from those background checks about what type of firearm is being purchased. So there are laws in the United States that do not allow us to keep any information about who is getting a background check from the FBI. They're called the T-Hart Amendments. Todd T-Hart is the representative who they were named after. He was the representative here in Wichita for a really long time. So I'm very familiar with him. But we don't have the actual information about what type of purchases are being made, et cetera, from those background checks. But in our data specifically, we're asking about people who they themselves own a firearm. And so to go kind of back to your first question, um, we know that so I don't have the data specifically about young people, about what type of firearm they're purchasing. But we know that really since the 1980s, the number of handguns in particular that have been purchased in the US have really skyrocketed. And so more people are purchasing handguns than any other type of long gun today. And so we can make the assumption there that these young people are purchasing handguns in particular. Again, we don't have that data from the background checks because all of that information is erased after the background check is passed. That's what the T-Hart amendments say the federal government has to do. So we have very little information. And even the data about, 75 million Americans own 400 million guns are all estimates because we have no way of truly knowing how many firearms are being purchased in the US. We get some estimates from gun dealers who tell us, how many guns they sold in a month, et cetera. But that doesn't account for anything sold at a gun show or, friend to friend, family to family. And so unless someone is telling us in a survey that they own a firearm, we really don't know how many guns are actually out there. And even then, surveys, we're just looking at a sample and not the entire population. So getting some of this data is incredibly difficult because of these federal laws that exist in the US. But we can make assumptions based on what we do know. Things like firearms or people who purchase firearms are more likely to buy a handgun today than any other type of gun. Um, that we know that when crime rates in someone's community go up, the number of gun purchases in that community also go up. All of these things that we can make assumptions and extrapolate from for gun owners, but I don't have the specific information that you're looking for, unfortunately. Those are great questions.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to jump in with, I'll give you a couple questions. Um, there's two things I'm thinking about. One is your findings around political identification and formal partisan identification, and the
Mhm.
sort of mismatch between a more liberal age cohort and more conservative sort of firearm related behaviors and beliefs. And just maybe a couple of weeks ago, there was a opinion piece in the New York Times by Kristen Solstice Anderson that was, I think the title was something like "Being Independent Doesn't Make Someone Moderate." It was
Mhm.
probably more eloquent than that, but that was the general.
Yeah.
So I'm super interested in terms of when we think about how we characterize the size of the debate and the discussion, and when we think we're messaging to certain people, and the sort of, I think, what you've shown, this misconception that those 45% in the middle are independent, right? For the non-political scientists and on the meeting, they may not have the same mantra that independents are more partisan than partisans. But so I'm interested in sort of what you see as some of the implications of that and how we may think about that as we navigate this debate. So that's one. And then I'm also interested a bit in, as we were talking about before everyone else joined on, like, so from what we know, from what you and Abby have found, how do we think about what we're seeing in the US right now, and what does that make us kind of expect or look at as we expand whatever this cohort definition is, or if we start a new cohort? Like, how are you thinking about that? Because I would guess you are.
Yeah. Um, so the first question, can you give me a summary of your first
Yeah,
question? I'm so
sorry,
sorry.
the rambling didn't like all crystallize. Come on. Yeah, so my first question is, how do we think about the finding that independents aren't necessarily moderate, and this
Mhm.
mismatch between generational liberalism and conservative ideas when it comes to firearms may be kind of bearing out in this growing group of independents that we think of and often mischaracterize different than they are?
Yes. So as Jennifer mentioned, we know that in a public opinion survey, about 40% of Americans will tell you that they are politically independent. That true number is about 10%, because the rest of them really do vote consistently for one party over another. And so, what we're seeing, particularly among young people, whether they're gun owners or not, is that they are part of that 40%, where they don't identify as belonging to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but usually the Democratic Party, because we know that they're more liberal or progressive. But they do very strongly identify as being progressive. That for most of them, they would characterize themselves to the left of the Democratic Party. And then you also have young people who, maybe are conservative on more economic issues, but they don't really care about the social issues that the parties are fighting over, right? They don't necessarily care about abortion and gay marriage and trans athletes and all of these kind of hot culture war issues. And so they're not really identifying with the Republican Party either. And so they're really falling in the middle of these 40% independent voters. Um, and what we can see here, right, is they don't have that partisan identity. But that also means that they're not necessarily taking cues from those political parties either. So one of the major pieces of power that political parties have in any political system is their ability to message, and their ability to frame issues, and to act as a heuristic for voters that don't have a ton of time to be able to research all of the issues before an election. And so young people are also not using political parties in that way either. So they are more likely to either not pay attention to politics at all, or to pay a lot of attention, but to get their news from non kind of major news sources. So from TikTok, from Threads, Instagram, etc. So they're very political, even though they're not necessarily partisan. But that also affects, how they think about firearms. And so maybe they're not identifying with the Republican Party, so they don't necessarily think that owning a firearm is a normal thing or things that they should be doing to protect their Second Amendment right. But maybe they own a firearm because they're paying attention to all of these, progressive social media influencers and progressive news that's on social media telling them that they do indeed need to protect themselves. And so we don't really have enough information to say what exactly is happening on this spectrum. But we do have enough to know that young people are not partisan, but definitely engaged in politics. They pay attention, they care about politics just as much as older cohorts. That they are more likely to get their news from non-traditional sources. And so all of that can and probably is playing out in whether they're choosing to own a firearm or not. And the second part of your question, so we were talking about this a little bit before you all joined, but there is a lot of political instability, a lot of social instability in the U.S. right now. There are lots of mostly, but not only young people attending these anti-ICE protests. And so I do think that we are likely to see another gun buying spree in 2026. Again, we're not going to have that data yet, but we will within the next couple of months because anytime there is political instability, we typically see that firearm purchases go up. We also, this is not a presidential election year, but we also see that during presidential election years in particular, that firearms purchases go up. Specifically, firearm purchases among Democrats go up after a Republican president is elected, and vice versa. So after a Republican president is elected, Democratic gun ownership goes up as well. And so we're in a really contentious year, even though it's not a presidential election. There's lots going on at the federal level, there's lots going on with the president and Congress. And so I think we will see some of those same effects this year, even though it's not a presidential election year, which we would expect to see some of this increasing firearms purchases from. Did that answer your question, Jennifer?
It did very much. Thank you. Eric, you want to jump in?
Hi, thank you for an outstanding presentation. It was incredibly thoughtful. And the question I'm going to ask is beyond the scope of it, but I'm curious what your perspective is. The reason we care about firearms, I would posit, is because people die by firearms. And when there are more guns, we see more fatalities. What do you think are the implications for kind of these demographic shifts in terms of is it risk around suicide, homicide, lethal confrontations? Where are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there's very little academic research about, kind of young people in particular, outside of kind of the 1990s that I have found in the last couple of years. Um, but I definitely think that the fact that young people are more likely to be affected by gun violence, whether that's in their community, whether it's in a mass shooting event at a school, at a club, whatever it may be, is impacting young people's perceptions of firearms differently than older generations. And so they are, like I mentioned earlier, much more likely to think that there should be stronger regulations on who can purchase a firearm, but also increasingly purchasing firearms themselves as well. And so there is a little bit of this disconnect, but it it really follows the mentality that we know from even older gun owners that most gun owners do support some types of regulation, regardless of their age, and that they think that law-abiding citizens should be allowed to purchase firearms. And so young people are seemingly playing out in that very similar direction, that they themselves want a firearm for self-protection reasons, but they also think that the government should regulate who can purchase firearms, and there should be stronger regulations to prevent things like mass shooting events, to prevent things like violence in their communities. And so, for the most part, we see that young gun owners have similar views to other groups of gun owners that are kind of those non-strong 2A advocates of gun ownership. Though with what's happening in Minneapolis in the last week or so, this is all getting really muddled, and we're gonna just really have to wait and see how this plays out. But the fact that young people are more likely to be impacted by gun violence, I think, is definitely a component of why young people are purchasing firearms for their own protection. But again, at the same time, do you think that there should be legal restrictions on who can purchase firearms to protect people who shouldn't be able to from being able to purchase them?
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? We have a little bit more time. All right, I'm going to give you another minute or so just in case there's anyone who's formulating a question. And while I do that, I want to just make sure you all saw that Mark put in the chat information about our upcoming on target sessions. Dr. Stephen Hargarten is going to talk to us. His talk is really super interesting, I think, looking at the impact or the thought of classifying bullets by the impact or the damage they do to a person rather than just by caliber. So, and he has some really interesting experimental data to share with us. And if you have other ideas for On Target or you would like to share your work with On Target, you can reach out to us where Mark has specified the link as well.
Jennifer, can I just jump in with one very quick follow-up that I didn't ask before?
Please do.
Just on the urban-rural divide, and you said that they're young people on average. If you just look at young people, they're more conservative. They're more likely to be white, conservative. Did you say they are more likely to live in rural areas? The young people buying guns. Did you find significance
No.
for? No. So
We did not. Nope.
Did you put a dummy in for just rural urban? Did you put population? What did you do in the model?
We put in a dummy for rural in the model.
So other than that, the baseline is urban, suburban. That's the baseline, and then the dummy is rural.
Correct.
Okay, and you found no statistical difference. Okay, thanks.
Absolutely, Wendy. Thank you. And one more thing I'm going to put in the chat. So related to your question, Wendy, when you were asking about personal ownership, household ownership, we have at UConn Arms a couple of data sets that are available for public use. I'm going to put the link in our webpage. There's 2 independent samples. So we collected data in 2 rounds in 2022, right before Bruin, and in 2024, right before the election. And so the respondents are not the same across waves. I want to be clear about that. But within each wave, for each respondent, we have firearm and household, personal ownership, growing up in a household that had a firearm, along with measures of exposure to firearm violence, both witnessing and direct. So, and I encourage, there's just a request form you need to fill out. We're just keeping track of who we give the data to. But if you're interested or anybody's interested in sort of pursuing that question, if you look at who has been exposed to a firearm rather than just who owns, it's a pretty significant percentage of the population. I think in like 2022, it was like 60% of our sample. The first sample is just over 1,000. The second sample is larger. It's 2,500. First sample also has an oversample of Missouri gun owners. But anyway, so it's there. And if people are interested in pursuing those questions, to Alex's point, we can't quite make all of the links because we can't link that to purchase data, but we can look at exposure, and we have questions about ownership, the types of weapons they own, how long they've been an owner, and their carry practices. So I'm just putting that in the chat, and we are happy to share. Okay. Anything else for Alex while we're here?
Hi, I have a quick question. Hi,
Hi, Mark.
Alex.
Hey, Margaret, how are you?
Oh, good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Well, I'm sure that you heard about, what happened in Lawrence. For the rest of you, I'll just quickly describe. We had a shooting in a bar, or right outside a bar, by a couple of young people, and so there were 18-year-old shooters, and there were 18 and 16-year-old victims. But I'm just wondering if does any of your data or can you speak to how young people are actually using their guns? They say it's for self-defense, but do you have legal versus illegal ownership at all? And do they talk about whether or not they're carrying and sort of what those rates are? If you could sort of elaborate on that, it'd be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have that data. I wish I did. But it's an interesting question, right? Especially because gun laws vary state to state. And so, like, gun laws here in Kansas are a lot more permissive than in other states. And so I wish I did have that data. Unfortunately, I don't. I'm sure it exists out there somewhere, but I have not yet been able to find it. But it is this interesting question because we typically think of people who commit acts of violence, especially young people, as not having legal access to that firearm. Whether it's because it wasn't legally purchased or it's not registered, kind of depending on the state law. I don't unfortunately have that. But I wish I did, and it would be a great research paper to write. So if we find that, we should work on that together, Margaret.
Okay, well, thank you. And actually, that's a good idea. We should collect that data. So
Yeah, that would be great.
thanks for the talk.
Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, this has been very exciting for me and very thoughtful. And I appreciate the good conversation. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. Alex is on sabbatical, and so she is using time that is very valuable to her to share her work with us. And I do appreciate that. I hope we see you all in February or in March and or April or May. We are pretty much every month. We usually take 1 month off in the summer. Thank you and have a great afternoon. Stay warm, everyone.
Thank you all for coming and for having me.